AP Econ, welcome to the week of March 30th. This video is going to go over the homework from chapter 33. So you should have your homework in front of you. If you don't have that out right now, please put the video on pause and go get your homework and have it out in front of you while we go over this. Also, please, when I go into some detail on a few things, take some notes on this stuff. The homework questions are going to remind me of things that we would have talked about in class if we were having regular classes, and I missed them in the short videos that I've been making for you. So we're going to start off with discussion question number 2. The question says, what are government's fiscal policy options for ending severe demand pull inflation? Everybody did well on this. You answered that the options are to reduce government spending, to increase taxes, or some combination of the two. If you said in your homework that contractionary fiscal policy is what is called for, that's correct, but it's not enough. What is contractionary? It's reducing government spending and increasing taxes, or a combination. The question goes on, which of these would be favored by a person who wants to preserve the size of government? And of course, they wouldn't cut programs, they would raise taxes. Which would be favored by a person who thinks the public sector is already too large, and of course they would want to cut spending, cut some programs, and leave taxes where they are. The last part of the question went into the ratchet effect. How does it affect anti-inflationary fiscal policy? So the ratchet effect, of course, means that prices are inflexible downward. So if we're going to shift the AD curve back to the left, we're not going to slide down the short run AS curve and get to a lower price level. We're going to move horizontally back, the ratchet effect. So the ratchet effect means that the goal is not necessarily to reduce the price level, but rather to slow down inflation or stop inflation, try to keep inflation below 1% if possible. The government actually, or the Federal Reserve Bank actually targets about a 2% inflation rate. If we can keep it under that, we're doing well. So that's number 2. Make notes if you need to. Number 4 is the next one. Some politicians want to enact a constitutional amendment requiring the federal government balance its budget annually. It goes on to say this would force the government into a contractionary fiscal policy whenever we were in a recession, which would, of course, just make things worse. So the balanced budget is what a lot of state governments have to do. As I said in an earlier video, what often happens when we go into recession, the state of California sees lower tax revenues coming in. So somewhere along the line, they have to cut spending. And of course, cutting spending just pours fuel on the recession and makes it even worse. If the federal government had to balance its budget, it would simply make things significantly worse. In the modern world, we cannot have that. So the federal government's budget usually tries to, A, counteract all the state governments who are cutting spending during a recession, and then go beyond just counteracting what the state governments may be doing and actually provide some stimulus. Okay, so most of you did very well on that one. Number 5, explain how built-in or automatic stabilizers work. What are the differences between proportional, progressive, and regressive tax systems as they relate to the built-in stability? So most of you, again, did well on this answer. When GDP is rising, so are tax collections. Taxes are going up. And at the same time, welfare payments and transfer payments are going down. So, are going down. So taxes are rising. People are not getting as much money from the federal government, and that dampens or slows down the expansion that may be causing inflation. And then during a recession, when the GDP drops in a recession, of course, tax revenues go down, and because of the progressive tax system, they go down by even more proportionally than the reduction in GDP, and government spending increases in terms of welfare payments, unemployment benefits, etc. And that tries to fuel the economy and provide some stimulus to for the economy to recover. And then on the proportional regressive progressive situation, a progressive tax rate is the most important one because it's going to slow down the economy when we are in inflation more than a proportional or progressive tax structure would. And when we go into recession, the progressive tax structure is going to provide more stimulus by cutting taxes more than a proportional or regressive tax system would cut taxes. All right. Number 7. Number 7 was the one about time lags. Again, most all of you did a good job explaining the 3 different types of time lags that there are. Most all of you, and you quoted from the book, and that's what you should have done in your homework to talk about the political business cycle. You did a good job there. And then the last part of the question asked what the crowding out effect is. And again, a lot of you copied out of the book, which is exactly what you should do, that the crowding out effect is the reduction in investment spending caused by the increase in interest rates that arise from an increase in government spending financed by borrowing. So here's a place where I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's not necessarily in the homework, and that is whenever you are doing an AP economics test, macro test, and it talks about a recession and the government having a deficit budget, you should always assume that the government is going to cover that deficit budget by borrowing. Okay? Now, it could cover the deficit budget by just printing the money and not borrowing it. That would be very inflationary in the long run, and they generally don't do that. The United States government does not do that. Some foreign governments actually do, and we talked about some nations that had inflation rates into the millions and even trillions. So that's when you just print money. So the federal government of the United States and most governments around the world, and you should assume on the AP exam, that they are borrowing the money in the loanable funds market in order to cover their deficit. All right. And that reminds me that we can use this moment to do a little review of the loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market is not the same thing as the investment demand curve. So the demand for loanable funds is not the demand for investment. Okay. The supply of loanable funds is not the supply of investment. Okay. That's not the way to talk about it. Loanable funds are just that. It's money that people have saved, whether they're average folks like you and me that have just a normal bank account, or whether they're really rich guys that are invested in, that have their money in money market accounts or with some kind of an investment agency that is using their money for them. So the loanable funds market, the horizontal axis is the quantity of loanable funds. I usually just write LF, the loanable funds, but we could write capital Q sub LF, quantity of loanable funds. The vertical axis, I've always called it the interest rate with a small I. I've noticed that in AP exams, they use R here instead, okay? So I'm going to put a comma there. Lowercase r, not a capital R, lowercase r. R means the rate of return. Well, that is the interest rate. So to tell you the truth, the difference between I and R is frankly this. The I usually means nominal rate of interest. The R means real rate of interest. And since, in fact, in the loanable funds market, when we draw the graph, we mean the real rate of interest, I'm going to start using R instead of I here, okay? Lowercase r, the real rate of interest. And so the demand for loanable funds, D sub LF, the supply of loanable funds, and the equilibrium interest rate, we'll call it small r1, in the loanable funds market. That's not necessarily the overall interest rate in the economy, but it's going to be very, very close. as we talk about different interest rates, and there's going to be a money market diagram coming up in the next chapter, 34. We'll find out that the interest rates, you can assume on a test that they're all the same. Whatever this rate is, it's going to be transferred into the money market account also. So just a brief comment on the loanable funds market. Don't confuse it with the investment demand curve. Remember, the investment demand curve only has the investment demand line. There is no supply curve in this graph. And this one, again, you can either use lowercase I or lowercase r, whichever you want. But the horizontal axis here is the dollar amount of investment spending, which is a component of GDP. Don't confuse these two graphs. All right, I'm going to wrap this video up right here, and the rest of the homework questions will be on the next video.